Hi there fabric jugglers, it's Babs here from Fiery Phoenix, and today we're going to be filming the second half of the girls dress pattern number 13 from E+M Patterns. Alison did a brilliant job creating us this PDF pattern that we've already printed out and assembled. So today I'm going to be cutting out the smallest version, which is size number 2, which is what I'm going to make for my niece. I'll be making it in a purple floral, and you're going to be coming along for the ride so you can see what happens and how. So stay tuned and I shall start cutting out the smallest pieces. So on this pattern, there is a mark that we need to transfer for the side seams. We need to take into account the grain lines, and again there are 2 lines for the lining. So these are our pieces, these are our pattern pieces. So now that we've cut out our pattern pieces, we can move on to positioning them on our fabric and cutting out our lining and our ties. So we'll do this. We have a single piece of fabric folded. We're using the selvages to ensure that we've got a straight grain fold. And what I'm going to do, because this is made of many pieces of paper, I am actually going to use pins, not near the edge because I don't want to affect the cutting line, but for each piece of paper I will pin it in place so that we can have an accurate cut. So that's the first piece, and I haven't stuck it to the table. Now this is cut 1 centrepiece on the fold, and then cut the lining after, again along the fold. This piece is cut 2 of the entire piece, but mirror images. So having it onto folded fabric means that we've got that sorted out immediately. Now what I want to do is pin this piece first, as it's the loosest and smallest, and then make sure everything else then ties up in relation to that piece for the shape of the pattern. These are the 2 bodice pieces that we're going to now be able to cut out. Long, smooth strokes with the scissors, and unlike last time, we're now using our tailor's shears as we're cutting through the fabric and not the paper. The 1/2 inch seam allowance has already been included, so we don't need to cut away from the edge. We can cut right, we can cut tightly. So what we can now do is transfer the markings. So depending on which size you're using, you have a different sew down to this point mark. Mine is there. And then again we have a sew until here mark. And on this side we have a sew here. Always keep your marks within your 1/2 inch seam allowance. Unpin everything. is the front of the dress. And here we have two parts that are the back of the dress. And the last thing we need to do with the pattern pieces is cut along the lining cut line, not with our shears, with our paper scissors, so that we can cut out our linings. So we go through the same process, although before we start this I need to cut out the ties. I need 1 inch wide. I need 30 something inches. However, this is a standard size piece of fabric which is 24 inches wide, so I'm just going to cut one 44 inch 1 inch down. And the quickest and easiest way to do that is with snip and rip. So we literally take a measurement, snip, and then rip that piece off. It's a true grain, which in this case is very wonky from the actual original cut, but that's why we do a true grain snip. That is very different to the original. So now that we've got true grain identified, we can actually do a snip and rip for 1 inch. So we find that 1 inch mark, and we again snip, and then rip it off. And that is an even 1 inch. It's the quickest, simplest way. Take it to your iron, press it before. Okay, so we've got the thread changed on the sewing machine. Everything's threaded up. We've loaded up the bobbin. I've actually just changed the needle, so I've got a nice clean start to this project piece. And the first thing we need to do is sew together all of the shoulder seams on the dress outer and also on the dress lining. So I will go ahead and do that. You can pin it if you want, but this is such a short seam, I don't think I will bother with the pinning of that. I'll start off with a sewing spider just to get everything moving, and then I will run a short reverse stitch in at each end of the shoulder seam. Off the spider and then move across to the other hem, the other seam, and then repeat. And do the same on the lining. So right sides together. Make sure that the ends match up. spider. And then onto the final shoulder seam. Once we've done all 4 of these, we will then press the seams open. So we're then going to press these seams open. We'll set them first and then press them open. And the next stage that we need to do is make the button loops and ties. Now I've already pressed these in place, which is creating a straight of grain binding basically from the 1-inch strip which we had earlier. If I just open this out, you fold it in half, you iron it in half. Let's see if I can actually open that out so you can see it. So you press it in half, then you press either side back towards the centre and then press it closed again along the original line. What I'm going to do is move my needle across to the far right and then sew this along so that we have that neatly caught. In fact, I'm definitely going to run the sewing spider through this one because we really don't want any nasty snags caught on the edge of our our binding. This can be quite fiddly, but just once you've started it, it should be fine. If you need to straighten it partway through, you can, but it just gives us a half line down the centre, which then catches all the loose ends. There we go. And that's finished. You can trim that off. And there's our bias binding for the loops all created, or at least the straight of grain. So, what we've got now are our opened out seams. We've pressed them open on both our outer and our lining. We've created the length of binding, and we've taken a 2-inch portion of the binding which we're going to sew onto the right side at the back. So we turn it the correct way out, which gives us the right side. I've measured down 5/8 of an inch and made a mark to show me where 5/8 of an inch is, so that at that point I can sew this piece on. And start here. I'll just tack it to begin with. Pin it to begin with. Loop that around. Pin it again. And then we're going to baste over the top of it. I'm going to use a nice long tacking stitch and a bright red cotton so that you can see it. And I can see it when I come to unpick. And we just need to go into the loop, into and out of the loop again, just to hold it in place whilst we're sewing everything together, because the next stage is to attach the lining to the outer around the neckline, which will catch the button loop in place. So now we'll turn this right sides up and we will then pin everything back together. And there our marks that we transferred from the pattern here, and these need to line up, as that is the top of the sleeve hole or the armhole. It's always easier to remove pins if you put them with the point facing in. Much easier to remove them as you're sewing towards them. Try and match up the seams on the shoulders if at all possible. Make it look far more professional that way. Come back around the other side. Make sure that our markings that we transferred are going to align. Put one here, here. And make sure that we catch the end of the loop as we sew over it, so that we secure that in place once we turn this the correct way around. And again, make sure that the seams line up, which they're doing very nicely. And make sure this lays flat, and then sort out the centre of the neckline. Pop one in there. So now we can sew this all together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Lost my pedal. There we go. I'm going to lengthen the stitch slightly to 2.5. And what we want to do is to back stitch a little where we're starting. To give it some security. As you can see, this is nice and easy to remove now. Not getting all cat-handed. And remember to field check that we're including those loops within that seam allowance. And we'll come up to about 1/2 inch away from the edge, and then rotate as we sew back down that side and around the neckline. Always, if you're pausing, make sure that the needle is down. Oh, I flung it off over there. Always make sure that the machine needle is in down position, so that if you have to raise the foot for any reason, you're not going to lose your stitch position. The last thing you want is jagged stitch lines. It's fine if that's what your design calls for, but if not, it's a real pain. If there is one seam line which is slightly smaller than the other, it's always a good idea to follow the smaller of the two. Then you definitely know that you're catching all the edges, and it will lie flat when you turn it the other way around. And then we can lift it. Continue round to the end. And again, we're going to pivot on this corner here when we're 1/2 inch away from the edge. Lift, rotate, drop it down, and then we can just come down to the final marking. stitches here, and then we'll do a little back stitch. So now that we have sewn around the neckline and the back, we now need to sew around the sides. And again, there are points that we've marked which are sew to here marks, which we'll do on each sleeve. So I'll pin those again so I can see what I'm doing and make sure that everything lines up as nicely as I can make it. I will again match up those points. Yeah. And what is a blessing is that these points are actually matching up quite nicely. There's nothing worse than sewing to a pattern and finding that it's not matching anyway. So on the other side, let's just remove that spider. On the other side, on the other sleeve, we'll do exactly the same things. We've got markings and the two are matching up, which is excellent. I tend to pin just a smidge away from the very first where I'm going to start so I can get the needle in place before I begin sewing and removing the pin. And then we can start sewing these together, and again use a back stitch at the outset of that sewing. With a 1/2 inch seam allowance again. Pins flying around all over the place. That's one side, and then over to the other sleeve and do the same again. Exactly why we use the sewing spider, so that any nastiness gets caught on the spider and not on your pattern. So let's try that again. I tend to use one spider fresh for each project because otherwise they just become a mass of tangles. Remember, we're doing a reverse and then moving on. So there we are, with the sleeves sewn up. What you might want to do at this point is actually go back and sew over the loop. So where you have the loop on the back piece, you might prefer sewing over this a couple of times. So I'm just going to take a couple of extra stitches and I'll put them on the inside of the seam allowance, so it's still going over the button loop, but it won't be visible. And I'll just run that backwards and forwards a couple of times for extra stability. So that's now 4 rows of stitching across the loops. We can now remove the tacking stitches. And we can clip the corners and clip into the curves so that we can then turn this out the other way. It's literally just clipping to allow for ease of movement. Snip diagonally across the corners to make that a nice sharp turn, and then we'll do the same as we clip round the shoulders, avoiding stitching. We do not want to cut through our stitching at any point. And then the other corner. So now we can pull the back pieces through. Turning it the right way out. Same on the other side. Find your fingers. And put it all through. And now I'm going to pop off. There's the nice corner. There's the lining. And we should have here a corner and the button loop. And there's the red thread, the other end of the red tacking thread, so we can remove that as well. And I'm going to go and press this, and then I'll be back to the next part. Having ironed that, having pressed it, we now have quite an impressive looking inner. We have the fabric loop, and we have the outer, and you can see the construction for the sleeves now. Now the next stage is to turn it right sides together, and we're going to sew the side seams. So I'm going to pin and sew those. We're going to start at the point that we finished with the armholes. So we'll need to open this out slightly so we can actually see where those points are, and then pin them very carefully together. You don't want to overlap anything. You need to stay together. And we really do not want to sew over the top of the existing stitch. We need to start directly under that stitch and then come down with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way to the end. Now the pattern actually says that this might take quite a bit of manipulation, but I've not actually found that to be the case myself. Nice clean lines, nice clean pressing, and it seems to line up quite nicely without the need for lots of manipulation. So I'll pin both sides. And we're going to back stitch at the beginning again, just to make sure that everything is nice and secure. I'm trying to drive the pedal through the foot of the table, that's not going to work. can do the same for the other side. Now that we've done that on both sides, we then need to do the centre seam. And in the same way, we'll match it up, cut away any loose threads. We'll match it up and then all the way down to the end. Be careful not to sew the front of the dress into the seam at the same time. Now, what we're going to be doing is pressing the seams open, turning them slightly and then top stitching them down. So I'm just going to shoot over to the sewing machine and I'll just shoot over to the ironing board, and when that's done I'll be back. Right then, so now that we've successfully top stitched the hemming, what we need to do now is pin the lining so that it matches up with the seams underneath in the centre and on both the sides, so that we can then turn this and top stitch. Actually, we don't need to turn it. We can then top stitch around the neckline and around the sleeves. So that's what I'm going to do next, now that I've actually pinned these in place. So we'll start with the neckline. I've set my stitch length to 3.5. And I will start at the bottom and work my way all the way back around to the other side. Which may prove interesting with having to twist the fabric about, but we shall see how that pans out. Just be very careful you're not sewing it onto itself around the neck area. When you're turning and twisting, always make sure that you leave the needle in the down position, because there's a lot of fabric to move around. Try and maintain a consistent, even distance from the edge around the neck hole, even if it's not quite the same as where you're coming down the seam lines. Pivot to come back down. And I've left a distance here as we will be turning and hemming, which we can't do if we've obviously sewn that in place. So here we have the top stitch on the back, on the inside rather, and here we have the top stitch on the outside, which is very nice. So I'll just go through and do the rest. And then so to recap, by now you've seamed the dress and you've overstitched and secured with top stitching the raw edges. You have top stitched the lining of the bodice and you've reinforced the back opening and the two sleeves with multiple stitches going back and forth. We've already got the tab in place, and what we now need to do is actually add in the casing for our elastic. Now the elastic for me is going to measure 20 inches. I've double checked this on the child that I'm working for, and that 20 inches is going to work quite nicely. So don't overstretch it, just check to see where the 20 is and then cut that off. So what we're going to be doing now is to fold the lining's bottom raw edge towards the wrong side. So what we need to do is turn the dress so that it gives us access to just the lining now. We don't want to be sewing anything else into this. So whilst this looks rather claggy, it will actually make some sense in a moment. So we've now got the skirt coming out the top of the neck hole, and then we've got the lining left. And you can see why I left this unsewn now, because this is what we're going to be using to turn into the casing for the elastic. Now you might be able to hear my little niece in the background. She's around here today, so if there are extra noises, then hi there. I'm sure she'll say hello at some point or come in to ask a question. So I'm going to turn this under ½ inch, and then we'll have to press that, and then just double checking the pattern, we're going to pin the lining to the dress once we've folded that under and pressed it. So I'll just get that pressed and then I'll come right back. So as my video decided that it was going to cut out while I was sewing the casing, I'm replicating that so you can actually see the process. So we have our lining, which has been pressed under, and we have our body fabric, or the main fabric that we've used for the dress. So what we're going to do is actually create casing that will hold the elastic. So I've got some of the spare elastic here as well. So what you need to do is make sure that the machine is threaded, you've got a sensible stitch length, and I'm going to move this over to the right, the needle to the right, so that I can control how closely that is sewing to the bottom of the folded lining. So we start, and we need to leave some space for the casing. So back stitch that, move it away, and then we'll start sewing again, remembering to start with the back stitch, which will strengthen that section, and then top stitch the lining all the way around the dress. Now obviously I don't have a complete dress, so I should just stitch to the end of my sample. Now that you have that, we will just trim this up. Well, if I can find my scissors, which are hidden under my fabric. Right, so now that we've sewn this top stitch, we will trim away the excess for the centre, and what we need to do is sew a second line of stitches which are far enough away to allow for a nice smooth insertion of the elastic. So we'll pop this in, and before we start sewing we will double check that we can fit the elastic in. I'm just going to move that over slightly so we've got a nice even fit of the elastic between that initial line and where we're sewing now. So we'll continue on. try and maintain that distance. If you feel that you're not sure, you can stop at any point, lay in the elastic again next to you, and make sure that you've got enough gap that you can happily sew that channel through. You do not need to leave the gap when you're sewing the top portion of that channel, as you'll be threading through the gap that you've left here. We will assume that the dress continues around as so. But for this demonstration we would then thread that through here. So I would use my safety pin, put that through the end. I never just put it through once, I always put it through twice, just to be extra secure. And then you put that through and you thread that carefully around the entirety of the dress through the channel that you have created. As long as you've kept that channel even, it will be a nice simple process that won't be too tricky. Once you've completed that, come out to the other side, all the way around the dress, and then what you will do is have it coming out the other side of the channel. And so you'll undo the end of the pin. One thing that you really want to be careful of when you're threading through is that the second end doesn't accidentally get pulled through. So that's always fun to keep an eye on. So then what we're going to do is stitch the end of the elastic together. So if possible, if at all possible, keep the rest of the dress out of the way, which in this instance is very easy as it's a very small scrap of fabric. Drop the needle down, or drop the press foot down over the top of the elastic, making sure that they're actually overlapped. I'm going to change this to a nice big zigzag. Keep the length of the stitch quite small, around the 2 mark, and then we're going to go back and forth a couple of times. Just to secure that in place. You don't want the elastic coming undone once you're wearing the dress. And then that can be neatened up, trim up those loose edges, and then that can then be pulled through and back, loose thread, back into the body of the dress. So you then have an elasticated waistband, and from the front of the dress you have a very subtle elasticated channel and very subtle stitching. Back on to making the next step of the dress. So here we have an example of one of the ties already sewn in place, and what I'll do is walk you through that process with a length of the binding that we created earlier. And need to make sure that the that the elastic is evenly positioned, because when we sew the tie on, it will be sewn through the elastic, the outer and the lining, which will keep the elastic in place so that it doesn't dribble back and forth, but you do need to make sure that everything is where you want it to be to do that. So we'll just slide that under the sewing machine, making very sure that we're not sewing anything else into that. I tend to sew them on slightly forward of the seam line, only by about ½ centimetre or so, purely so that they sit nearer the front, and I think they look quite pretty that way. So we'll just sew this in. It's a straight stitch, and I just go back and forth several times to make sure it's not going to fall off. That's all there is to it. And then remove that from the sewing machine, trim off the excess threads, from the inside and the outside. As you can see, it's gone all the way through, so it's going to secure everything together. And then tie yourself a little bow. You can tie this in any way that you like. Some people tie it in one way, some people tie it in another. It's personal preference as to what you find works for you. And then make it the size that you're happy with, and you can trim off any excess from the tags and the ties as you see fit. I tend to cut them at a slight angle to make them look just a touch prettier. So there's the dress, and now we just need to finish off the hem. Now the hem is a very straightforward process. It is simply half an inch pressed, and then we're going to top stitch the hem. I always start from a seam so that it hides the start and ending of that sewing line, and I also backstitched for security. I'll go for about 2.5 stitch length. And off we go. The most important thing here is to be consistent with the length from the bottom of the hem. Doesn't matter how much fabric has been folded up above the hem. Be consistent with what we see from the outside of the hem. As long as you've done your pressing carefully, this part will just come together quite nicely. Again, make sure that you don't actually sew anything else into the seam. And when you come back round to the final join, make sure that you are keeping those stitches in a straight line. So wherever it joins up, it'll look nice and even. There we have our completed hem. And the last section, the last little task that we need to do once we've sewn on these faux ties is to make sure that we have our button on. So pop a pin through the buttonhole in the centre of the buttonhole, and then that you can use as your marker when sewing your button on. In this case, I'm sewing the button on by hand. However, it is also an option if you're sewing 2 buttons on, or if you're sewing lots and lots of these types of dress, to use the sewing machine to attach. I've got a tutorial which I will link to in the description below, which shows you how to sew a button on using your sewing machine, using a special button foot. But I just don't know where my button foot is, and as this is only one single button, I'm not too fussed, so I shall just sew it on by hand in this instance. But as I say, if I was making several of these, then I would do it using the machine method. It'd be much faster when I have more than one button to do. But with just the one button, actually finding the foot, loading the foot, moving everything around isn't going to save me a whole lot of time. I might as well just get on and sew it. Remember to knot it off nicely. And then we have the dress finished. Just to show, the button will fit through the loop, and hopefully the grey that I've chosen will echo the grey in the fabric. So this is the reverse. Here we have the front, and I would
just need to go and find my little model to see if she'll try it on for me. But either way, hopefully this tutorial has been of help to you. Hope it's been useful, and if that's the case, please give it a thumbs up, have a look around, make sure to share it with your friends, and preferably it would be great if you could subscribe to the channel as well. Take a look around to see what other videos that I've done, and if there's something in particular you want, then give me a shout, let me know, give me some comments and feedback, and I'd love to see some examples of these dresses that you've made. Obviously I've made this in the teeniest, tiniest size that there is on the pattern, just so that you can see it on the screen and because it will fit my little niece. But I'd love to see some in all the shapes, sizes, fabric combinations, and it'd just be great to see what you can make of them. Speak to you later.